In 2014, researchers at the University of Virginia ran a study. They put participants in a plain room. No phone, no book, no music, nothing to look at, nothing to do. They were asked to sit quietly with their own thoughts for 15 minutes. That was the entire study. Sit alone, think, 15 minutes. Most participants rated the experience as deeply unpleasant. Many said it was one of the more uncomfortable things they had been asked to do. And then the researchers added a variable. They left a button in the room. The button, participants were told, would deliver a mild electric shock. They had already experienced the shock before the study began. They had already said, when asked, that they would pay money to avoid experiencing it again. When left alone with their thoughts for 15 minutes, 2/3 of the men in the study and 1/4 of the women pressed the button. They chose a shock they had said they would pay to avoid over sitting alone with themselves. That study has been replicated, extended, run across cultures and demographics. The finding holds. Most people, when placed in unstructured solitude, no task, no stimulus, no external anchor, experience something the brain registers not as peace, but as threat, not boredom, not restlessness, something closer to low-grade alarm. The nervous system treating an empty room the same way it treats a dark alley at night, as an environment that requires escape. We live in a culture that has built an entire economy around that alarm. Phones, streaming, notifications, the endless scroll that asks nothing and offers everything. Every one of those technologies is, at its most fundamental level, a solution to one problem: the problem of being alone with what is inside you. Welcome to Dr. Cole's Dark Psychology. I'm Dr. Evan Cole, behavioral psychologist and behavioral analyst. Today we examine one of the most universal and least examined patterns in modern human behavior: the inability to tolerate being alone. Not the social preference for company, not loneliness, the painful experience of unwanted isolation. Something more specific and more structurally important than either. The specific neurological and psychological mechanisms that make unstructured solitude, time alone, without task or purpose, feel for most people not like rest, but like something that needs to end. And what those mechanisms reveal about the choices people make to end it, including some of the most consequential and most damaging choices they will ever make. Before the neuroscience, precise distinction. Solitude intolerance is not the same as loneliness. Loneliness is the painful experience of feeling disconnected from others, of wanting connection and not having it. Solitude intolerance is something different. It is the specific inability to be comfortably alone, even when connection is available, even when the person has just come from a full, socially rich environment. The person who fills every quiet moment with noise, who cannot drive without a podcast, who checks their phone before the previous check has fully registered, who experiences the space between social interactions not as rest, but as something to get through. That pattern, the compulsive filling of silence, is what this video examines, not as a moral failing, as a neurological condition with a precise origin, a precise mechanism, and consequences far larger than most people who live inside it understand. When a person is alone with no external task or stimulus, the brain does not go quiet. It activates a specific network, the default mode network, a set of interconnected regions that become most active precisely when external demands are lowest. The default mode network is sometimes described as the mind wandering. That description is incomplete. What the default mode network actually does, in the absence of external distraction, is process the self. It surfaces unresolved emotional content. It runs simulations of past events and future possibilities. It examines the gap between where a person is and where they thought they would be. For people who have unprocessed emotional material, unexamined grief, unexpressed shame, accumulated losses that were never fully sat with, the activation of the default mode network is not neutral. It is the experience of having all the things you have been avoiding arrive simultaneously in a room you cannot leave. The amygdala, the brain's primary threat detection system, responds to this activation the same way it responds to physical danger. It does not distinguish between an approaching predator and the surfacing of a memory you have been successfully avoiding for 3 years. It fires. The cortisol rises, the heart rate elevates slightly, the body prepares to act, and the only action available, the only thing that reliably ends the activation, is distraction, external stimulus, noise, connection, anything that redirects the default mode network away from the self and back toward the world. This is the neurological basis of solitude intolerance, not weakness, not shallowness. The amygdala doing precisely what it was built to do, identifying an uncomfortable internal environment and generating the motivation to escape it. The problem is not the mechanism. The problem is what the person builds their life around to keep the mechanism from firing. The structures people build to avoid the experience of unstructured solitude are often invisible from inside them. The relationship that exists primarily as company, not chosen for who the person is, chosen because the alternative is an empty apartment that the nervous system has decided it cannot survive. The career that fills every available hour, not because the work is meaningful, but because stopping means sitting with what the work has been avoiding. The phone that is checked before the eyes are fully open in the morning, before the default mode network has had a single moment to surface what was processed during sleep. These structures are not signs of a full life. They are often signs of a life organized around the management of one specific internal experience, the experience of being alone with yourself. The relationship consequence is the most significant. Research consistently shows that solitude intolerance is one of the strongest predictors of remaining in or returning to relationships that are no longer functioning. Not because the person does not know the relationship is damaging, not because they cannot see what it costs them, but because the alternative, the empty room, the quiet evening, the unoccupied Saturday, activates the same threat response that the relationship, however painful, reliably suppresses. A difficult relationship is noise, and noise, for the solitude-intolerant brain, is preferable to silence, regardless of what the noise is doing to the person it surrounds. This is why people go back, not because they do not know better, because the nervous system, in the absence of the relationship, experiences something it has been conditioned to treat as more dangerous than the relationship itself. Solitude intolerance is not a personality trait that some people are born with and others are not. It is almost always learned. In early environments where being alone was consistently associated with something aversive, with emotional unavailability from caregivers, with neglect, with the kind of early experience that teaches a child that solitude means something is wrong, the nervous system learns to treat aloneness itself as a signal of danger. The adult who cannot sit in a quiet room without reaching for their phone was, in many cases, a child for whom quiet rooms were not safe. The brain that learned then is operating now. It does not know the original environment no longer exists. It knows one thing: alone feels like this. And this needs to end. That learning is not permanent. It is not destiny, but it cannot be unlearned by simply choosing to sit with it. It requires something more specific and more patient than willpower. The smartphone has not created solitude intolerance, but it has made it invisible. In every previous era of human history, the inability to tolerate unstructured solitude eventually became visible because the options for avoiding it ran out. The phone has removed that visibility almost completely. A person can now move through an entire life, from waking to sleeping, without a single uninterrupted moment of genuine solitude. Every gap is filled before the gap is felt. This is not a technology problem. Technology does not create the avoidance. It simply makes the avoidance so frictionless that the thing being avoided never has to be named. The question worth asking is not how much time you spend on your phone. The question is, what happens in the moment before you reach for it? What arises in that 2-second window between stillness and stimulus that makes the reaching feel necessary? That 2-second window is where the entire pattern lives. I want to be precise about what this video is not saying. It is not saying that wanting connection is a problem. Human beings are social animals. The need for connection is not a weakness. It is one of the most fundamental features of what we are. What this video is saying is more specific. There is a difference between choosing company and needing it, between wanting to be with people and being unable to be without them, between a life that includes rich connection and a life organized around avoiding the one experience that would require you to sit with everything the connection has been keeping at a distance. The person who learns to be genuinely alone, not performing solitude, not productive solitude, but the real thing, does not become less connected to others. They become, for the first time, someone who is choosing connection rather than fleeing its absence. That is a different kind of person to be in a relationship with, and a different kind of life to be living. If this gave you a framework for something you have been moving around rather than through, that is exactly what this channel is here to do. Subscribe to Dr. Cole's Dark Psychology. Every week, the neuroscience and psychology of why people do what they do when they are in pain, in power, and in patterns they built before they ever understood what they were building. No labels, no lists, no easy answers, just the science underneath the behavior. We'll see you in the next one.